Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. By God's word at last my sin I learned, then I trembled at the law I'd spurn, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly own him as my King. Now my raptured soul can only sing of Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan, oh, the grace that brought it down to man, oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary.
Wanderers are back into the fold again. You'll turn to the first book of Samuel, chapter 26. This is where we pick up the story of David as a fugitive this morning. 1 Samuel, chapter 26. Now, in this chapter, which I don't intend to read because it would take up some of our time, in this chapter we find the Ziphites apparently still anxious to curry favor with King Saul, attempting to betray David yet again. Now, you remember the Ziphites I mentioned earlier were the dwellers of the hill country of Judah, and that was the territory where David was, at least in part, spending his time and hiding. Now, I said, didn't I, that they're trying to curry favor by betraying David yet again, and I say yet again because there are some commentators, as I mentioned last week, who think that what we have in chapter 26 is simply a repetition of the event in chapter 24 told by a different historian. That's one of the critical comments that's made on this section. But of course, as so often happens with the critical commentators, they're influenced by the superficial things, and they really don't consider the story properly. I've discovered this time and time again, particularly in reading the historical books. They like to see the hand of several authors in a book, and the more authors they can discover in a book, the more brilliant they regard themselves to be as critics. And usually a little bit of common sense, which is a rare commodity among many of the critics today, would show them that you do have continuity and unity in these Old Testament accounts. After all, why should they put two accounts of the same story by two different authors? Surely the people who've had to deal with the Old Testament scriptures over many, many centuries are not so stupid as to be unable to detect when the same story is being told a second time. And I think that here, while it's true that at first glance the story is in chapter 24, which is the story of the cave, where King Saul was in the cave and David cut off a piece of his garment, and this particular story here, they do have some things in common, which is understandable. And there are certain similarities that can be pointed out, and we'll look at these. For example, in both of the stories, the ones who attempt to betray David to the king are the Ziphites, evidently people with an abiding hatred of David. In both stories, King Saul comes from Gibeah. He comes with the same number of men, 3,000. David's men urge him to kill the king. Something is removed from King Saul, or his presence, and his life is spared, and Saul weeps and expresses himself to be sorry that he's treated David like this. Now, these are the points of similarity. If you count them up, there are about 7 altogether there. But you know, that's where the resemblance ends if you'll examine the two stories properly. And even if you look at the so-called points of similarity, there's nothing particularly brilliant about them. They're the points of identity that you might very easily expect to find. For example, there's nothing remarkable, as I say, in the Ziphites having failed the first time, trying again to betray David, because they were his permanent enemies, just as King Saul was his enemy. And there's nothing remarkable in King Saul coming from Gibeah, when after all his court was at Gibeah. That's exactly where he lived. And there's nothing remarkable in the fact that he came with 3,000 men, because the 3,000 men, as becomes evident in the reading of the Scriptures, was a standing force that he had, composed largely of his favorite Benjamites, the people of his own tribe. There's nothing remarkable that David's own men should urge him to kill King Saul when he has the opportunity. And there's nothing remarkable either, from what we know of David, that David should feel that's a terrible thing to consider, that he would stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. David would never do that under any circumstances. And there's certainly nothing remarkable from what we know of King Saul's mental condition that he should break down and profess to repent and be sorry that he behaved like that towards David. No. The differences between the two accounts are far more important and far more significant than these points of similarity. For example, the first time that David spared the life of King Saul was some time after the Ziphites had informed the king of David's whereabouts. And the trouble is, people tend to confuse or mix up, let's say, two different incidents. The Ziphites had gone to the king to tell him that David was up in the hill country there. And you remember that if you read that story again, you'll discover that Saul had gone with a strong force and had almost trapped David. He'd almost surrounded him, when news came that the Philistines had made an attack on Saul's territory, and Saul abandoned the hunt for David and went off to meet the Philistines, and David managed to escape. It was some time after that Saul, still bent on capturing David, found himself in this cave, and that's where the incident of the cave occurred, when David took the piece of Saul's garment and then told him, "I could have killed you, but I didn't, because I wouldn't stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed." Now, another thing here. The first incident, when David knew that the Ziphites had informed Saul of his whereabouts, he went into the wilderness of En-Gedi. This particular passage we're looking at today, David is living, he's abiding, he's dwelling in the wilderness of En-Gedi already. Two different stories. One story concerns a cave in the daytime. The other story concerns Saul's camp at night, when Saul is sleeping with Abner, his commander, and his other men around him. In the one story, David and his companion actually go down into Saul's camp under cover of darkness, and they take Saul's spear and water bottle. That's the story we're looking at today. In other words, it's David who takes the initiative. He doesn't meet Saul by accident, or Saul doesn't come into his clutches by accident, but David's own spies inform him where Saul has his camp. And under cover of darkness, David goes down into the camp, And he takes these articles, he goes out at the other side, stands on the top of the hill, and he calls to King Saul. So the initiative is David's. So really, if you examine the stories properly, although there are two accounts of two different events, and there's no reason to see it any other way. And of course, on top of it all, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that in the course of the years of hunting and wandering, David would have two opportunities of taking the life of King Saul. An interesting thing about this, as I say, David goes down into the camp, and Saul is asleep. And we're told that there is there the spear stuck in the ground at his head, and there is a jar of water at his head. Now, the spear stuck in the ground was always the symbol of the chief or the king. You would go way back to the book of Genesis 49, where in that marvelous prophecy concerning Judah, saying that the kingship should belong to Judah, the dying Jacob said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet," or the lawgiver's staff from between his feet. Whenever the tribe met in council, the staff or the spear or the rod was planted in the ground between the legs of the king. Whenever the king was asleep in the camp, his spear or rod was stuck in the ground to indicate that's who the king was. So what the spear signified here was royalty. Again, the jar of water, you say, well, why ever should they take a jar of water? What would they want with that? Well, that was a rather special jar of water, because in those days there was one of the servants of the king whose particular task it was to look after the water jar. It was a special water jar. It was to be used by the king when on a journey, either for his ablutions, for washing, or for providing him with a drink of water. And it had always to be there, reserved exclusively for his use. It was a sign of royalty. Just like the crown, just like the spear. And the loss of that jar of water would actually signify, strange as it may sound, a loss of face for the king. So you can understand then why David takes the jar of water and the spear, the emblems of royalty, to indicate that he's got so close to the king that he could have taken his life. And then he gets to the other side of the hill, and in fact it says in verse 13, David went over to the other side and stood afar off on the top of a mountain, with a great space between them. And then he called, first of all, to Abner. He taunted Abner with his inability to look after the king, his inability to guard the king properly. He says, "Will you not answer, Abner?" And then Saul, recognizing that he has been, very close to death, had David cared to take his life, again professes repentance. He says, "I have played the fool." And I don't think there's another man in the whole of Bible history who more frequently said, "I have played the fool," than King Saul. Those words, "I have sinned," came very easily to this man. And it's even possible on this occasion to take these words, "I have played the fool," not to indicate that he was really sorry for the way that he's behaved towards David, but he's expressing a kind of regret that his camp's been so very badly guarded, that David could so easily get into the camp. And certainly, in verse 25, those words have a very hollow, insincere ring. "Blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things, and shalt still prevail." Well, evidently David didn't take those words seriously. He took them with a pinch of salt, because the next move that he made was right out of Saul's territory. He didn't trust the king after all of these honeyed words. And this actually is the last time David and King Saul spoke to each other. They never saw each other again. Certainly David never looked upon the king either in life or in death, because very shortly after this, Saul was defeated in battle by the Philistines. His body was actually mutilated and nailed to the wall of Beth-shan, and incidentally the place, not the body, but the place, is still shown to tourists today. The village of Beth-shan is on the route of the tourists in these days. And it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who came and they took down the remains of Saul, and they burned them before burying them under a tamarisk tree. And incidentally, if you read through this book, you'll discover how much Saul seems to have loved trees. It seems to have been the one slightly redeeming feature in the character of an otherwise unpleasant personality. In fact, there at Gibeah, he had his home under a tamarisk tree. He simply loved the trees. And with a very human touch of affection, even for this man, the men of Jabesh Gilead buried him under a tamarisk, buried his remains after burning them under a tamarisk tree. Very respectful gestures, I say. Now then, that is, as I say, the last time these two men met. In chapter 27, David doesn't realize that, of course, but in chapter 27 here, David is still afraid of King Saul. He's getting more and more depressed and more doubtful of his possibilities of survival, as you may very well expect. So what he plans to do is to leave the territory of King Saul entirely and go back into the land of the Philistines. And that's exactly what is recorded here in verse 1. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. Now, you might ask, well, why ever would David consider going into the land of the Philistines, the traditional bitter enemies of his people? And for that matter, why ever should Achish, king of the city of Gath, allow David to come into his city and give him hospitality? Because that's exactly what happens. David goes over, 600 men with him, and their families too, and they come to the king of Gath, and he allows them to live there, and they take up their residence in the city of Gath. Now you say, well, why? Why should this happen? After all, David's reputation as a warrior, the way that he dealt with Goliath, the great defeat that David inflicted on the Philistines in those days, their greatest major defeat. Again, as I said, the abiding hostility between the two peoples, the Philistines and the Israelites. And you can understand why there's hostility. The Philistines, as you may well know, are said by one of the prophets to come from Caphtor. And we think that might originally have been the island of Crete. We think that they were people from the Mediterranean, adventurous people who came out in their boats and they landed on the coast of Palestine. They landed in Palestine perhaps along with the sea peoples of about 1200 BC. And they settled on that coast. They were trying to make a home for themselves. When they landed on the coast there, the Israelites had come in from the south, from Egypt. So the two peoples, Israelites and Philistines, arrived in the territory just about the same time. And there was a constant struggle for supremacy at this particular time. Eventually, of course, as you know, the Philistines were contained in that little southern strip of the coast, and they had these 5 major cities. I suppose you might call them city-states, each one ruled by an independent king. In this particular case, the king of the city of Gath, Achish. And they were warlike people. And since they were fighting with the Israelites for survival, you might say, we ask then why ever should these people extend hospitality to David, who's inflicted such terrible defeats on them in the past? And again, he's already been there once before, hasn't he? Just when his life as a fugitive began, he went down to Gath. And somebody recognized him, or thought they recognized him. They said there's a striking resemblance between this fellow and David, who's fought against us. And so David then had to feign madness, pretend to be mad, knowing that the people of Canaan, the ancients, would not kill a madman because they believed that the Spirit spoke through him. And David pretended madness and eventually made good his escape from the city of Gath. Why then should, on this occasion, the Philistines extend hospitality? Well, I think that the answer is fairly simple. The first time David went down to Gath, he was a fugitive, and almost alone. And his presence in Gath as a solitary, lonely fugitive could have been a source of embarrassment to the Philistines, and might very well have stirred up King Saul to make another attack on them in order to get David. And on top of all this, David couldn't have contributed anything in a battle against King Saul. He was weak, he had no forces, he had no men with him. But this time, the second time, David comes at the head of a small army. At the head of an army of at least 600 highly trained and experienced men. And more than, I believe the band actually would be more than 600. The 600 refers to the original company that he had that went out to be with him at the cave of Machpelah. But by this time, David's numbers have swollen because other men, dissatisfied and dissident because of Saul's ineffectual government, have come to join him. So now this kind of force could be a very real assistance to the Philistines in a battle with King Saul, and obviously by this time the Philistines have come to recognize that the break between David and King Saul is complete. That David is an enemy of Saul, and therefore they're quite willing to have the resources that David has at his disposal. They think that he'll make a good ally. Now, if you look at verse 4 of that 28th chapter, it was only after King Saul heard that David had moved outside of his territory that he sought for him no more. The very last words in the verse. Well, obviously, outside of his kingdom, David would not be a threat to him as a king. In other words, Saul didn't feel himself intimidated any longer by David's presence. And, of course, Saul also knew that he couldn't possibly reach David without launching another attack on the Philistines, something which he certainly didn't wish at this particular time. Now, whether he really felt that he'd seen the last of David or not, we just don't know. Or whether he suspected that David might again sneak back into Israel, we can't say. In any case, the Bible says that he stopped looking for him. Now, how long did he stay down there? Well, actually, he stayed, as verse 7 tells you, 16 months. 16 months. And you know, as I say, they took up residence. And those 16 months weren't altogether unpleasant, it seems, for David. By that I mean that David's activity wasn't always warlike during those 16 months. They lived, as far as was possible, a fairly normal life. In fact, if you look at Psalms 8 and 81 and 84, you'll find that in common with many of the other Psalms, there's a little phrase at the head. In those three Psalms, 8, 81 and 84, it says, upon the gittith. Upon the gittith. Now, that word gittith is an adjective, actually a feminine adjective, that is derived from the word gath. And it's possible that it refers to the Philistine style of playing that's indicated here. That while David was down there among the Philistines, there in Gath, he studied the style of playing, the type of music that the Philistines enjoyed. And he had the time, even there, to write some of these psalms. His artistic ability was exercised, that's what I'm trying to say. But let's go back to verse 5. When Saul, where are we? Verse 5. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? Now, David wants to live outside of the city of Gath. He doesn't want to, well, putting it very bluntly, he doesn't want to be under the eye of the king all the time. He puts it very diplomatically. He suggests that really it's an imposition on the generosity of the king for David and his company to live there in the royal city. In actual fact, David wanted to get out of the sight of the Philistines so that he could go about the plans that he had in mind without being spied upon. He wanted to have an army in a base from which he could launch raids on the wandering tribes of Canaan, and particularly the wandering Philistines south of Judah. You see, there are two different attitudes here between Achish and David. Achish knew at this time, and this is something we need to bear in mind, Achish knew at this time that his Philistine confederates were building up their forces to launch a major attack on Israel, to have a full-scale war with King Saul. And we know that that actually took place not long after this, on the slopes of Mount Gilboa in the plain of Jezreel, or Esdraelon as it's sometimes called, where King Saul and Jonathan were in fact killed. But Achish is looking for David to help them. And he wants David to get out there and attack Saul's territory south of Judah, to weaken it, to nibble away at the strength of King Saul. On the other hand, David must have been aware of what was going on, and he had his own plans. His plans were to attack the Philistines in secret, to harm them. And that's what he did. However, I think you've got to face the fact that what we're looking at in this particular chapter 27 is probably the darkest chapter in the whole history of David, and I mean the whole history too. Not only because he's accepted the hospitality of the bitter enemies of his own people, and undoubtedly is branded a traitor in the eyes of his own people at this time, during the 6 months' absence from his own territory, but there in the territory of the Philistines he finds himself doing things that I think would have made him despise himself at another time. And we'll look at that in just a moment. Some of the sheer brutality and the callousness of David's behavior at this time is really, it is appalling. There's no other word for it. The Philistine ruler allows David to go into the city of Ziklag. Now, Ziklag was a city that the Philistines had earlier taken from the tribe of Benjamin. It would appear from the text that they'd left the city deserted, but it was there, away from Gath, and David was allowed to go and occupy it with his people. And from Ziklag, David went out and raided the Philistine tribes, particularly the nomadic tribes wandering there in the south. Now, this is where he pulled the wool over the eyes of the king of Gath. David would come back, and he would bring, because he was really a servant of the king of Gath, a bondsman in a sense, and he would bring back a portion of the spoil that he gained and give it to the king. And the king was delighted. And he would say to David, "Where have you been today?" And David said, "I've been in the Negeb of such and such of Benjamin, the Negeb of Judah." In other words, he told the king of Gath that he'd been raiding the territory of King Saul, when in actual fact he'd been a long way from Gath. He'd been way down south, near the border of Egypt, raiding the rich Bedouin tribes there, the Canaanite tribes, the Philistine tribes there, and bringing the rich plunder back. He'd not taken prisoners. He had not wanted anybody to return and report to the king of Gath that David had been raiding Philistines. And so he was reduced to killing men and women, slaughtering everyone who could possibly get back and report what he was doing. It was a terrible course of conduct for David to involve himself in. He was playing a very dangerous game of deception, and he left nobody alive. And it seems he carried it off effectively, though, because Achish gloated over what David was doing. And if you read verse 12, you'll see how he felt about these reports of David. Even though David's lying to the man, in verse 12 we read, Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made himself utterly abhorred by his people Israel. Therefore he shall be my servant always." It seems that Achish actually liked David. trusted him and felt, I'm never going to lose him. He's going to stay here for good. And he didn't really know that David was actually lying to him and actually slaughtering the Philistines. Now, with that in our minds, we come to the story in chapter 28. The Philistines have prepared for the war that I mentioned a moment ago. And it's worth noticing that this is the first time that the Philistines have contemplated a major confrontation with Israel since David killed Goliath and since their army was defeated so decisively in the battle that followed. And obviously there's a good deal of thought and preparation gone into their planning, because they're not satisfied any longer with these little skirmishes on the borders, on the edge of King Saul's territory. When we read this story in chapter 28, we find that they've been strong enough to march into the center of Saul's kingdom and to challenge him to battle on the plain of Jezreel, or Esdraelon, as it's called, as I said. And of course, it must have been a very fearful, a very anxious time for King Saul. He discovers the Philistines in strength in the heart of his territory. And I believe that it was that perhaps made David realize, as he hadn't realized before, exactly what a great mistake he'd made. Of course, when he'd gone to the Philistines, he'd been afraid then. But as I say, those 16 months spent down there had been 16 months of deception and lying and cruelty. And now he's going to be called upon to fight against his own people. As she says, "You will go up to battle with me." After all, the Philistine had no reason to think that David would be unwilling. And David doesn't want to. He doesn't want to say. In fact, he temporizes. He says something and nothing, in fact. He says, "You shall know what your servant can do." That's neither one thing nor the other, really. You can read that any way you want. He knows he daren't refuse to go, and yet at the same time he's appalled at the thought of fighting his own people. They already regard him as a traitor. They know that he's fled to Philistia. And incidentally, that also may be why, even after David became king, it took 7.5 years before the whole of the 12 tribes accepted him, because they didn't trust him. This is one of the prices that he's going to have to pay for going down to find shelter with the Philistines. And I can't help feeling a bit sorry for the king of Gath. He's been taken in so completely. And I suppose that, considering his position, he behaves rather well. He says to David, "I'm going to give you the most honorable place in the army. I'm going to give you the command of my personal bodyguard." He has no suspicion whatsoever. But on the other hand, it seems that in other quarters there were suspicions and there were doubts, and it's even possible that some little whisper had leaked out of what David was actually doing down there in the wilderness of Shur, close to the border of Egypt. Because when the other Philistine commanders heard that David was going to be there, they objected, and fortunately David didn't have to go to battle against his own people. But anyway, verse 3 of this 28th chapter takes us back to Israel again. It shows us King Saul in his anxiety, and it shows us the steps that he took to try to dispel his fears. Verse 3 reminds us again of the death of Samuel that we talked about last week, and this again has been mentioned by the critics as evidence of two different historians. But surely it's not necessary to think that this is the hand of another writer at all. It's simply explanatory. It simply shows to reveal Saul's desperation and to explain the course of action that he took. He can't get an answer from God. Samuel has died. God doesn't answer by Urim and Thummim, we're told. Now, you might say, well, how does that come about? Surely the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate, have been taken by Abiathar down to David. Absolutely true. But you see, King Saul has made Zadok high priest, so that there were two high priests at the time there. Zadok with King Saul and Abiathar with King David. Abiathar had the genuine ephod and the genuine Urim and Thummim. And it seems to me to be pretty conclusive from the text that an imitation ephod had been made for the use of Zadok the priest, and God didn't answer that way. God didn't use that to speak to King Saul. So King Saul feels very, very much alone. And in his utter desperation, just shows you the mind of the man at the time, he thinks about his old friend Samuel, the man he's despised for so long, the man that he's banished, and the man who is now dead. He was the only real friend that he ever had. And it's surprising, he was always my best friend. You treat your friends badly, you lose them, and then there comes a moment when in a maudlin burst of sentiment you say, it was the best friend that I ever had. That's exactly what happens here. Best friend I ever had. I should never have driven him away. He's dead now. And so he resorts to a witch at Endor. Again, it shows you Saul's state of mind, because to get to Endor, which was about 10 miles from where Saul's own camp was, he had to actually go around the camp of the Philistines. So to keeping to the hillside, and maybe using the shelter of the hollows of the hill, he goes in disguise in order that he might not be recognized by any Philistine who might see him. And he gets there to Endor. Now, you understand that this was a woman who, the Bible says, had a familiar spirit. And I take it to mean that she was a woman like the mediums of our present day, because the word from which we get our word's familiar spirit is a word that sometimes means a hollow thing, or a bag, or to speak with a hollow voice. In other words, it indicates a ventriloquist. Now, these people, the mediums, those who had familiar spirits, the wizards and the witches, were people banished by God from the territory of his people. And you must understand that we're talking about something that is essentially Canaanite. We're talking about the kind of pagan black magic, you might call it, that the people found when they entered the land of Canaan. And God commanded that these people should be rooted out from his people. Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 to 14, if you want to make a note of the passages. Exodus 22, verse 18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Leviticus 20, verse 27. These are all passages relating to the way that they were to root out this evil from the people. And of course, even the later prophets said, when they said you go to the wizards that peep and mutter, should the people not go to their God? To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. So King Saul himself has on occasions launched hunts, maybe using informers for the job, to root out people like this woman to whom he's resorting at this time. And the woman knows it, but that was the first battle. I'm going to
O love that wilt not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be. O light that followest all my way, I yield my flickering torch to thee. My heart restores its borrowed ray, that in thy sunshine's glow its day may brighter, fairer be. O joy that seekest me through pain, I cannot close my heart to thee. I trace the rainbow through the rain, and feel the promise is not vain, that morn shall tearless be. O cross that liftest up my head. I dare not ask to hide from thee. I lay in dust life's glory dead, and from the ground there blossoms red life that shall endless be. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you o'er evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be free from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's tide. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be whiter, much whiter than snow? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Sin stains are lost in its life-giving flow. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb.